Good morning and welcome to the Vino Karma Project's forum, creating brand loyalty through the lens of diversity, equity, inclusion, and representation. Hopefully all of you can see me. I'm Amanda Laden, the founder and CEO of the Vino Karma Project. At Vino Karma, we focus on creating socially conscious brands, particularly in the beverage and hospitality spaces. We really focus on three core things. Number one, diversity, equity, inclusion, and representation. Number two, innovation. And number three, social change. During the past year or so, we've experienced somewhat of a collective reckoning as it comes to diversity and race and understanding our systems and structures and how they're set up within our organizations and our society as a whole. Consumers are demanding more than ever before from brands and organizations. They are looking across the entire value chain of the industries and asking what your organization stands for, how you're taking action, and how that's affecting everything from hiring to retention to promotion and what a consumer chooses to put in their glass. In fact, a recent study from Porter Novelli examined leaders' opinions on purpose-driven leadership and how businesses should engage on social justice and diversity, equity, and inclusion within the context of our rapidly changing world. Results show that 73% of executives believe that DE&I is a moral imperative that drives profit. Yet 43% of the leaders cite that they haven't done anything because their stakeholders can't agree on what action to take. Regardless of where you and your organization are on this journey, this is going to be an important conversation for you to understand what it means to be a leader in the beverage space and what you can do for DE&I and representation. Today, we're going to talk to an expert in DE&I, as well as a woman who owns her own spirits brand. And before I introduce you to these two amazing human beings, I want to let you know we are on Zoom webinar. So although we can't see you right now, please go ahead and ask your questions. We will be interacting with you. This is your show too. So if you have questions for us, I will ask Cornelia and Chanel, and we will be addressing them in real time. This is real, this is live. So there could be glitches, there could be things that happen. So please bear with us as well. Now I'd like to introduce you to our two panelists. First and foremost, Cornelia Shipley. Cornelia is the founder of 3C Consulting and a sought after speaker, professional development and diversity consultant and strategic planning expert who has worked with many clients to expand their capacity and increase their ability to drive clarity in their organizations and ultimately increase the advancement of critical talent in their organizations. She and her team have worked with a multitude of companies such as Procter & Gamble, Turner Broadcasting, GlaxoSmithKline, and she also is a strategic coach and consultant. So welcome to Vino Karma, Cornelia. I love seeing you, so thanks for joining us today.
Can you share with us the definition of intersectionality and how it relates to the American consumer and an employee?
Yeah, so I think, everything post 2020 has really put us in a position where we are defining intersectionality as the space and place where your employer brand, whatever, so that's about, think about this as your reputation on Glassdoor, what potential employees say about you, your consumer brand, so what people say about your product, and your stakeholder brand. So think about that as like what the street is saying about you intersect. And so it's about those three things, recognizing the reckoning that was 2020, the diversity tipping point, as many of us like to talk about it, has now shifted that landscape to ask the question across all of those stakeholder communities, what are you doing in the space of diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging? And to something a colleague of mine, Ron Harvey on my team says all the time, does your audio match your video? So your as an employer of choice, are you living your values? Are you committed to diversity and inclusion? Does that show in representation across the organization, et cetera, et cetera? On the consumer side, are you marketing to people of color, to the LGBTQ plus community? Does your brand resonate with that group? From a street perspective, if you're a privately held company and you want Goldman Sachs to take you public, do you have a woman and a person of color on your board? If not, they won't take you public. So it's about understanding that at every single point on the path, the world has changed, and the expectation is that you are going to have representation in the conversation at the table and making decisions about your employer of choice branding, about your consumable brand, and about what's happening to the rest of your stakeholders, including what's happening on the street. So what's the second half of the question?
There's another half?
Right.
I want to jump in here and ask, just, on that note, as you're thinking about that, I'm going to turn it to Chanel for a second. You are the first African-American female to own a vodka brand. You own a brand that you have built up, and you also, represent other brands in the marketplace. And so when we think about building brand with the lens of DE&I, how can brands and organizations go about, we're talking about these 3 sections that Cornelia was bringing up. Also, how can brands go about and organizations go about reaching the underserved markets?
I think it's important to note the access now to demographic and ownership data. That information is more available now as opposed to a few years ago. There really, to me, at this point, there really isn't any excuse or justification for real tangible efforts to be made here. Even more, right? Owners and leaders, as well as advocates in these markets, they're really speaking out now, right? They're talking about, they're very vocal about what they're lacking and the type of support they really need at this juncture for their brand, for their company. And so the access to this information, the data that wasn't really available before, I think kind of peeks into, what brands and organizations can do to reach the underserved markets. I don't think that data was necessarily readily available before. And so with it being very apparent now, you have data right in front of you. To me, there really isn't any excuse at this juncture.
I think it's interesting, there's a few folks that I know are on this, listening to this conversation, that are at the beginning of their journey with DE&I and how they approach their employees, as well as what they, Cornelia rightly so, put out to the market and to the street. And so, Cornelia, I'm going to turn it to you. There's some things that happened in the past year where, brands and organizations came out with really some tone deaf ads and some things catering to a certain segment of the population. As people are beginning their journey foray into this, what do they need to be thinking about for longevity? I think there's an idea that certain companies think we're too big to fail, so we can say whatever we want and it's not going to affect our market share, our revenue, our profitability. So Cornelia, what do you think companies need to be thinking about and brands need to be thinking about as they're starting wherever they are on this cycle of their journey?
Yeah, I think the biggest thing is twofold. One, there's the browning of America, and I'm going to have a U.S. Centric conversation for a second. We can talk about it more globally in a minute. And I get having a global conversation with 2 African-American women. One of the things I know, having done this work for a really long time, is that people don't perceive Black as global. Black people as global, diversity experts as global. I've lived, as Amanda knows, halfway around the world in Australia. I'm married to a man who lived in Japan for a year. So I have some sense, and I have a team that, that's very representative of the world, and not only of the United States. So at the end of the day, I would say, first and foremost, you have to understand that in America, the demographics are changing. And you just have to make a decision. And it is a decision, and it's not a right or a wrong one, it's a choice. And organizations have to just decide where they want to stand around meeting a particular segment of the population's need and speaking to that consumer. If you want that consumer's dollar, speak to that consumer. If you don't. On the flip side, from an employee population perspective, I was on a panel a couple of weeks ago, and one of the transgender experts on the panel said that in the population of people coming into the workforce right now, so that's people 20 to 25, 35 to 40% of them identify as either non-binary or transgender. So if you are going to have an inclusive organization and you want 40% of your workforce, as 40% of the available population is in that demographic, and you want good people, of which there are people in that population who are going to be amazing to add to your team, right, you're going to have to make sure that your brand is consumer friendly to that population. So it's just a question of who do you want to be able to work in your organization? And that's a question every single company is asking right now. Who can work here? And you've got to make that decision for yourself based on where you are in your journey, based on who you're really trying to target from a consumer perspective, and based on what your values are as an organization.
Agreed. And if I could just add to that, to that particular item, we really need to kind of move away from typecasting diverse communities, right? It somewhat can come off as lazy. I don't want to say it, but lazy for the most part. We are multi-faceted and multi-dimensional. Earlier, I think we talked about intersections, right? So it's important that brands tap into what is important to our communities in order for us to feel secure, right, with purchasing their products. So.
Yeah, I mean, if you think about what it means to be a Black woman, right? I could be a Black woman and be cisgender, heterosexual. I could be a Black woman and be transgender. I could be a Black woman and be lesbian. I could be a Black woman and be identify as queer. I could be female presenting and identify as non-binary, right? Mm-hmm. And so what does it mean to integrate all of that intersectionality and then speak to me as a consumer? And it doesn't matter, what color my skin is. I could be any of that, right? Regardless of what color my ethnicity might, what my ethnicity might be. And right. So as an organization, you just have to decide, how do you want to speak to the human condition? Yeah. Right? How do you want to speak to humanity about the value that they bring to you and your brand, and to connect with them on a human level, such that they want to actually be connected to and consume your brand?
Yep, agreed.
So this brings up to me another question, which is around, as we know, just over a year ago, George Floyd was murdered here in America. And there were organizations and brands that did nothing, said nothing, didn't approach their employees, their consumers, about it. And then there were some where it felt like it was, a bit of, there was a line between authenticity and performative activism. And we see that not only, with the African-American or Black communities as brands are talking to them, but also, with the LGBTQ plus community, with rainbows being, put everywhere, the month of June. And, what is it that I think these brands or organizations need to be thinking about as they move the needle forward and, really draw that line between authenticity and this performative activism? And I'll throw that to either of you.
Well, I'll just say this. I think logistically, where organizations are having problems and challenges that we see is having their values be actualized. And they haven't had to think about, we say we value diverse opinions. Let's just say that's one of the things on your wall in your office. And if that's on your wall in your office, and then, the entire boardroom is all white males, it's hard to believe. Yes, every white man has a diverse perspective. I'm not arguing that point. 100% agree with that.
I might argue it, but.
Amanda said that, not me. And so at the end of the day, if you don't have outwardly diverse people, difference that's represented, you can get into the debate about whether or not this value you've put on the wall is actually being lived out. So the work we do with clients is really focusing in on, here's what you've said you value. Are you ready, willing, and able to live up to that relative to a diversity, equity, inclusion, belonging, and social justice lens, also known as JEDI, for those of you who want the abbreviated version.
I appreciate that. And Chanel, I want to turn it to you for a second. You know, we've seen in the past year in the wine, beer, and spirits industries, and even in the past couple months, particularly in the beer industry, there has been a real reckoning around sexual, and we've also seen it in hospitality, right? We've seen chefs losing their jobs, women and other people coming forward to say, hey, I worked under this person and this is what I experienced. You know, again, when we think about this kind of reckoning around the sexual harassment piece and about people coming forward, you know, what springs to mind for you in terms of how these organizations or brands can address this in a way, again, that feels like we're actually being truthful and we're being authentic, because consumers are smart now, you know, they are watching.
I agree. You know, I think first and foremost, I think perhaps better training, right? As it relates to sexual harassment and better response when allegations do actually surface. I think that's important. I know organizations, even me, when working in corporate America, the amount of trainings that we go through, it becomes a lot. But, you know, I think it's important that we do address the issues that are happening in these organizations and get employees and the staff trained properly. Creating safe spaces for victims to come forward is also important, right? Because, you know, I'm telling you, at the top of the chain, you know, if you're being sexually harassed by someone at the top of the chain, you have fear of losing your job, you have, you know, and if if your job is, you know, and for most Americans, it is their way to survive. Some people actually, they live paycheck to paycheck. And so they don't want to rock the boat. They don't want to put themselves in a position where they're out of work. And so creating a safe space for victims to come forward and be supported, right? Without the threat of being fired, I think is very important.
Cornelia, anything else you want to add to that?
Yeah, I mean, I think this conversation has made me think about something that was said on The View a couple of weeks ago. LeVar Burton was on The View talking to Meghan McCain, and Meghan McCain asked him a question about cancel culture. And LeVar Burton's response was to say he didn't think we were in a cancel culture situation, but a consequence culture situation. And I wholeheartedly agree that we're in a time in history in the United States where people are having to deal with the consequences of their actions, and those consequences are now reaching people who historically did not have to feel the consequences of their actions. And so what that means for organizations is you have to now decide how you're going to hold people accountable. And in the world of wine and spirits, when you haven't done a good job of holding people accountable to moving cases of vodka, it becomes really hard to hold people accountable for sexual harassment and diversity and equity, inclusion, culture issues, et cetera. And so part of what the diversity tipping point has done is it's shown a spotlight on the fact that organizations haven't been able to really drive accountability. If you think about organizations that have been doing diversity and inclusion work for a long time, it is the initiative that historically was allowed to fail. Mm-hmm. Right? It was the thing that people would do some performative work around, but it was okay if we didn't hit our target. And it has been okay in businesses. You know, it hasn't been fun, but it's been okay in businesses at times if they didn't hit their case target. And now we're in a place where, from a diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging perspective, there are these broad-reaching impacts. There are these broad-reaching circumstances that are happening in the event you don't handle these issues properly. And thanks to Twitter and Facebook and Snapchat and TikTok and all the things, We're in situations now where brand management looks very different than it did when I started my career at P&G. Looks very different, right? And so every single person who works for you is a brand ambassador when they're at work and when they're not at work. And you need to have a brand ambassador policy about what that means and what your expectations are. And if you have one, when things like what happened with Amy Cooper, who's now suing Franklin Templeton, happen, you're in a position where you can legally defend yourself because you have a brand ambassador policy to cover you. So you've got to start to think through, what does it mean for people to actually work here? And what are our expectations around feedback and around performance relative to both delivering on the business and delivering on the culture?
I think that's a very valid point, because there could be some folks who are listening to this now, whether they're on here now, they're going to receive this later, that might have smaller brands. You know, they might have smaller brands in beer. They might have smaller burgeoning brands in spirits. And, you know, sometimes I think folks can get into a mindset of, well, we're really small and we don't have the dollars to put behind those efforts to think through what this means for us. And I think, Cornelia, what you're saying is, regardless of if you're a Diageo or a Constellation, or, you know, I'm just throwing those out there because they're very, very, very massive organizations with a lot of legal, you know, legal things behind, dollars behind them. You know, you can start, if you're, you know, it's something you can start thinking through as you're building the momentum for your brand, and you're thinking through who do we want to work here, and what does that mean for us as we hit the marketplace.
That's right. Yeah, I mean, it's a critical decision, and you've got to be prepared for the consequences, right? The problem is Franklin Templeton was caught off guard, and you know, our in-house counsel actually sent me the actual legal filing. I wanted to read it, and so he went and got it out of LexisNexis and sent it to me, the public filing. And the reason that she has a case is because, in part, and I am not an attorney, this is not legal advice, just for myself, so my attorney doesn't yell at me later. I'm not trying to interpret the law, but in my opinion, part of the reason that Franklin Templeton has a problem is because they didn't have a policy in place relative to their expectations of their employees when they're not at work. And we're at a place where, you know, if 2020 and the pandemic didn't teach us anything, back to this conversation about intersectionality, people are now working from home. So if people are now working at Starbucks, people are now working, you know, at Barnes and Noble or wherever they're working from. And so the lines have been blurred around when people are representing your brand and when they aren't. And it's up to the organization now to define that. And whether you are a brand of one or a brand of 1 million employees, you can define that.
Yeah, and I think as organizations are starting to ramp up and each state is basically reopened, you know, I'm here in California, and we're open, like it's like nothing ever happened in the world. And you know, the sales folks are going to go back out and hit the streets if they're not already, right? So they're going to be humping boxes out there if they're not already, because the restaurants are reopened if they can find the staff right now. But you know, so it's an interesting thing to, as organizations are saying, oh, wait a second, like we're now, and if anybody was furloughed on our sales team or whatever situation they were in, we now have folks going back out into the public domain. And what do we need to be thinking about in order to make sure that our brand is aligned with what we say it's aligned with? So those are, I mean, very valid points. I want to turn the conversation a bit to allyship, and how brands can start to think about this as they grow their market share and also business partnerships. And Chanel, I don't know if you want to take that one, as you know, because you've basically created a model for allyship with what you do with Bose Fest. And I don't know if you mentioned Bose Fest when I got knocked off the internet, but I hope you did. And if you didn't, please do mention or re-mention it again. But yeah, do you want to take that one?
Yeah, sure. You know, in terms of allyship, right? Sacrificing the time and true effort it takes, I think, to find synergy in allyship, it takes time to do that type of work, right? You have to be comfortable with getting uncomfortable. And I think in terms of allyship, there's always going to be some discomfort, right? But in order for you to form those allies, you have to kind of go outside your comfort zone to build those necessary relationships. Um, I know for a fact that one, it cannot be one-sided, right? So you can't expect all the work to be done on the side where you're trying to build that allyship with, and you're not putting in any of the work. That's important that it's a two-way street. You need to understand their needs and what makes them a viable ally, and vice versa, right? Um, but you also have to be patient with the process, right? Some people, they expect to form these relationships and then they have expectations right away. I think in any relationship, especially if on the ally side of things, you have to cultivate those, right? Those take time. Um, Effective relationship building is not an overnight thing. It just does not happen overnight. So um, I can give you an example. So for me, I realized early on that the monopoly that the Indian store owners have on the off-premise realm of wine and spirits, right? The majority of the liquor stores, if they're not owned by in Indian descent, then they're owned by Asians, right? Very rarely do you see any black-owned liquor stores here and things of that nature. But I say all that to say, when I first started, there weren't too many brand owners that looked like me. 12 years ago, it's totally different now than it was 12 years ago. But it definitely was a culture shock, right? And there was definitely some adjustment that had to be made for them as well as myself, because they weren't, they're used to a white male coming in trying to sell them products. They weren't used to a black androgynous woman coming in trying to sell them their products. But what I realized early on, my team is composed of men and women, but the majority of my team were women. A lot of my sales team were women and still is. And they would go into these locations and they would not get a warm response because, culturally speaking, the Indian culture does not, I don't want to say they don't respect women, but they don't hold them in that high regard as they would do a white male or any male for that matter. However, it was a different response whenever I walked in the store, which is strange, right? Because I would think that having a black woman who was masculine presenting walking into your store, you wouldn't receive that very well versus just a woman. But the respect, the response, completely 180 from just, an ordinary woman that's not masculine presenting walking into a store. And so I, the majority of our Indian retailers I interact with because I have the best relationships with them. We have the respect. They almost respect me as if I'm male. Strange, but that's how they interact with me. They don't look at me as a woman for whatever reason. But it just took years to kind of understand that dynamic. I thought maybe it was one or two stores, but after maybe 90 Indian stores that we probably have business with right now in Maryland, the dynamic was pretty much the same no matter where we went. And my team, we did experiences and things of that experiments just to see, is it really the fact that they just prefer to deal with a male? And in most cases, that is the case. But when it came to me, the response was completely different. I was treated as a male, as one of them. So, but yeah, in terms of allyship, I think it's important that we continue to put in the work on both sides, understanding the needs of both parties, and that way we can really build on that relationship.
Cornelia, anything you want to add to allyship? And, I think at one point in time, you and I had a conversation around this people think it's a zero-sum game. So anything you want to add about allyship and how brands can also be thinking about that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the zero-sum game piece is really about recognizing that there's more than enough for everyone.
Hmm.
And we act as if that's not true. And there's signs and evidence to support that. I'm not suggesting that people shouldn't believe their experience. I'm also acknowledging from a metaphysical perspective that there's something else you could choose to believe. And if you can stand in the space of there's enough for everyone, it becomes much easier to be open to people who are different than you, because you're not seeing them as a threat and as someone who might be taking away opportunity for you. I was in a conversation yesterday with a chief diversity officer, one of our clients, at a Fortune 100 company, and we were talking about the challenge she's facing right now is dealing with the white male backlash in her organization, because white men are now asking the question, can I work here? Is there space for me? That question in part comes from the perception that this is a zero-sum game. And if we promote Black and brown people, LGBTQ people, military veterans, other abled people, somehow my opportunity is now diminished and limited. And so allyship is about standing in the space of curiosity and interest in another human being, and then commitment to saying, let me get to know their experiences. You know, Chanel did a really nice job of talking about, I had a consumer base I needed to understand called the Indian community. And if I want to sell to them, I need to understand their culture, what they value, how they interact, what matters to them, and speak to them in their own language. And so then you can create the kinds of relationships Chanel now has with more than 90 retailers in her area to really support her brand and her brand's vision. The same thing is true for every historically excluded community, right? And you know, it might be easier in some ways for organizations to start with the community that's closest to them, right? It's part of the reason why white women, when we look at diversity efforts, white women are the women who are the ones who benefited the most. It's because it was the easiest connection for the majority, which was white men, to connect to. And so now you've got to take it a step further and say, how do I deal with these other people who look different than me, show up different than me, have a different experience than me, and take some interest in that and be open to what they might be able to teach me and what they might be able to show me about experiences, about the business, about ways of thinking about the business. The biggest example I have about that from an intersectionality perspective is the brand Tampax. So for the men of you in the room, I apologize, because that is a feminine protection brand. But Tampax and tampons were not something that women of color, particularly the African-American community, historically used. And there's lots of reasons for that. And at one point in the history of P&G, I was an employee at the time, they placed a multicultural woman who had a white mom and a Black dad as the brand manager for tampons, for Tampax. And because she had a white mom, she used tampons. Because she had Black friends, she had all these friends who didn't. So she had firsthand knowledge about why Black women, of whom she appeared to be, but was raised by a white woman, why that was the case. And so she was able to help the brand expand market share in a community which for the entire time they had the brand, Black women were not using it. And so she was able to speak to that constituency base. And so it's about saying, hey, let me be an ally. Let me support this person. Let me put give this person an opportunity. And they did that. And they more than doubled their business in the Black community alone. Not to mention the fact that there are other women of color whose cultures say that's not an appropriate thing. So they were able to take that leverage and learning and apply it to other constituency bases. The same thing can be said for every brand in America, right? You could take what you learn and apply it to other historically excluded communities. And so if you can get it right with one, you can then take those learnings and apply it and get it right with others.
Yeah, that's a great story that paints a picture that I hope people can relate to, because I think part of what's going on right now, at least from my my white female cisgendered perspective is that people are afraid to even open up the conversation. Which is why we're doing these things, you know, for those folks who have joined us, we appreciate you joining us, because, you know, even stepping into the conversation to saying what's missing here, because they were smart enough to say what's missing here, why can't we penetrate the market? And so, you know, I'm not saying every person needs to go out and hire, you know, a multicultural brand manager, but at least having the conversation to say there's something we're missing in the community when we're targeting that. And you know, it's time now to have the conversation. I firmly believe, this is my true belief right now where we sit in this confluence of what's happening, particularly in America, is that brands who are not, and organizations who are not, and leaders who are not having these conversations right now, you're going to be irrelevant within the next decade. And I don't care how big you are. It's you have to start doing it now because the work needs to be done. And as Cornelia, you said before, you know, the browning of America, what does that mean for your employees, your workforce, your consumer base? And it's really important to have those conversations. One of the things I want to talk about real quick, and I will open it up for folks who have joined us. If they want to ask questions, please go ahead and you can raise your hand, you can put it in the Q&A, you can put it in the chat. We'll monitor all of that. One of the things that really still baffles me, and I wish somebody would solve for it in the beverage industry, is you know, helping smaller brands get access to funding and to distributors who will pay attention to them in a larger portfolio of brands. So I don't know, Chanel, this is like a $1 billion question, but what do you think needs to happen in order to help these smaller brands either come into the market or get the funding they need to be successful, to have some shelf space?
Yeah, you know, you bring a great point up in terms of these smaller brands, such as myself, such as a lot of the brands that participate in the festival. You know, the inability to get access to funding, lines of credit, loans, whatever the case may have you, is one aspect of the spectrum. But the distribution, at the end of the day, without the distribution aspect of things, your brand can only go but so far, right? And so what distributors are requesting from these smaller brands, which they know is it's just unattainable, right? They're asking them to have, you know, $500,000 to $1 million in marketing dollars annually. You know how hard it is for a brand to even just get their product to market? You know, we need to have more expansive opportunities for alternate funding measures, right? What those are right now, I can't think off the top of my head, but we need those. The redlining that's happening, right? Oh. I hate to use that term, but that's what's really happening. You know, a lot of brands who are starting out, a lot of brands who are established right now come to me and they're trying to understand how I've sustained so long in this industry, you know, and what they don't realize is I myself have been redlined. I've been turned down for loans, lines of credit, things of that nature. And I've just been taking small steps. I'm not trying to, you know, because what the bigger distributors, what they're requesting for that $500,000, $1 million is to take over, you know, 3 or 4 markets at a time. And as a smaller brand, you have to kind of recognize where you are in this space and kind of take a slower, smaller approach to it. But in terms of getting the funding, you know, just like Bowls Fest, you know, we're creating, you know, scholarships, we're creating different things to help the smaller brands, because some people, they just need money just to finish their bottling, you know, just the small things. Forget about even getting to market, having marketing dollars. They just need to be able to finish the formula or their bottling. And with most manufacturers having minimums that are just ridiculous, you have to order 50,000 bottles at a time. A lot of brands can't do that. So we try to, with Bowls Fest, and, you know, as well as a distributor, I know I'm not requesting our brands to have this massive amount of marketing dollars. We do know it's some marketing dollars, right? But we also know that it's hard to obtain those type of dollars and funding. And so we take a different approach in terms of how we go after business with the smaller brands. You know, the bigger guys, if they have $1 million, it should be easy to get into 100 accounts, right? You got $1 million of marketing to work with, but we take a different, more grassroots approach with our smaller brands. And you know, we with Bowls Fest create certain opportunities for brands. And our scholarships aren't large, 5,000, 10,000, but it's definitely, I know in the beginning phases of my journey, you know, $10,000 went a long way, right? And so more expansive opportunities for alternate funding needs to be put in place so that, you know, brands can elevate for the most part.
Yeah. I appreciate that. There is somebody who's raised their hand. So Bernadette, I'm going to come to you in a second. I just want to make the point here about this is why, you know, here at Vino Karma and why we're having this conversation, we're looking at the entire value chain because there's kinks in the chain, right? If we're not looking back at the beginning part of where do people get the funding? How do they break in? Who's actually working the vineyards or in the distilleries? Are they earning a living wage, or are they dealing with modern slavery in our time because they aren't earning a living wage? You know, there's all of these things that are going on that, you know, I say is kind of like, it's time for all of us, all of the parties who believe in this industry, who love this industry, to say, hey, you know, what are we doing and how can we make positive impacts across the entire value chain? So I really appreciate that point. Bernadette, I'm going to come to you and I'm going to allow you to talk. So hopefully you'll be able to unmute yourself. You might just have to, there we go.
Yes. Hi, could you hear me okay?
You can.
Oh, wonderful. Yes, I had a couple of questions in terms of building the brand loyalty through diversity. The first question I had was in terms of, and I think there was a discussion already touched upon this, is access to funding with the redlining, because that is a huge impact on the growth and development of the business. I know that in my particular business, that was the reason as to its failure, was because of the lack of access to those very things. The other thing is in terms of distribution, what can be done for communities to create their own distribution companies if possible, since those that are available are not really helpful to smaller businesses. So those are the two questions I have.
So I can touch on the distribution aspect of things. To your point, what can smaller brands or smaller companies do on the distribution side of things? I learned early on that I wasn't going to get the recognition or the support from the larger distributors. You know, they just told me, you know, we have 200 vodkas in our portfolio already and you'll be 201. So I learned very early on that I had to find another way to get my product to market. And so I looked into becoming my own distributor here in Maryland. Once I realized, I went through all the loops, all the hoops, should I say, to become my own distributor. Then I started to self-distribute my product. Of course, that had its challenges as well. I won't lie, because retailers are used to dealing with maybe the top 3 distributors in a particular market. And so when I would walk into a new retailer and pitch my product and then they wanted to carry it, then they asked, who's your distributor? And I say, well, we self-distribute. And they were very leery. Since then, we've built up our distribution name and things of that nature. But in terms of becoming your own distributor, I think that is more than attainable. A lot of newer brands are doing that. I've had brands that I've helped mentor to come to market, and they decided, hey, I'm just going to, my desire is to get my product into consumers' hands. And right now, no one is paying me any attention. I'm going to become my own distributor. And so I help them through that process as well. So it's more than obtainable. The important thing when it comes to getting your own distribution license is always having a physical location. I think every state requires you to have a physical warehouse bonded, licensed and bonded, in order to store and sell alcohol out of, excuse me. So on the distribution side of things, it's very obtainable. I say go for it if, you know, the bigger brands or even the smaller distributors aren't paying you any attention. Because even my experience with a small distributor, and this is why, you know, being on the product and services side of things, it's important to me to provide the best service to my brands in my portfolio as possible, because I know what it's like as a person who has a brand. But I started with some smaller distributors, and literally they did nothing for my brand, and they were eating majority of the profit margin for the most part. And so you really want to do research on any distributor that you land with, right? But more importantly, the smaller ones, you want to make sure that they have the sales support team to support you and your brand, that they have the accounts already, right? Because if they're just starting and you're just starting, then what's the point, right? You can do this yourself. In terms of distribution, it's something that you can definitely do. I encourage it. I mean, I did it. I've been distributing my own product for the last 7 or 8 years, and then I realized I wasn't the only one having this struggle, right? And so I took my license, leveraged my license to help others get to market, because I know firsthand what that feels like.
I think the only thing I would add, and I am nobody's funding expert. That is not my expertise, but I do want to put a resource. I put it in the chat. It's just wefunder.com. They're an organization that will help you actually raise capital to actually find investors in your business. And so I know I've invested in a couple of businesses that way, one of which raised $4 million in less than a month on WeFunder. I don't know what the laws and the rules are, especially because we're talking about alcohol, and I don't know, but it's worth potentially pursuing and checking out to see if that's something that might be of support to you, Bernadette.
Awesome.
Yeah, and I think the other thing that I'm getting a little bit of hope for is I am seeing some other types of funds come up that are specifically targeted towards underserved or underrepresented communities. So, traditionally we know that, African American, particularly African Americans, get something like, what, Cornelia, you probably know the stat, less than 1% of any type of funding. And that's not through the bank, but, kind of venture funding and other funding. And so it's important also to think through. I think one other thing I would say in answering that question is, regardless of how big or how small you are, when you enter business, whatever business it is, there's a steep learning curve. And you really have to understand your market, and you have to know your numbers. Because if you're going out there to try to get funding and you don't know, in Chanel's case, you don't know that there's 200 other vodkas in a portfolio, and you haven't done your own due diligence, that's on you. It's like your responsibility to understand your brand.
Very true.
I'm going to ask both of you kind of a final closing question, and hopefully this will speak to some folks listening. Are there any, what are some immediate actions you think organizations, leaders, brands can take to approach to creating a more diverse and inclusive workplace which mirrors their customer base?
Yeah, I think there's a couple things. One of which is to, search in a different pond, right? Like you've got to start looking for talent in a different place. And when we say that there's not talent, not Black and brown talent, not other able talent, not LGBTQ talent, that's just not true. And so it's incumbent on you to say, how do we think about doing this differently? And how do you want to leverage technology? I was in a conversation in a strategic advisory session today with one of our clients, and we are talking about a TikTok strategy for them to reach, other folks, right, that are not typically reached in their demographic. So you've got to start to think about, where are the people who you want to reach and who you want to work for you, where do they sit? It's no different than anything else. And no marginalized community is monolithic, right? And so to assume that all brown people are economically disenfranchised is a wrong assumption. To assume that all LGBTQ people or all trans people are homeless is a wrong assumption, right? Like there's all of these things that are preventing you from potentially looking in places where you may already be, and you're assuming that people who look like Chanel and I aren't, right?
Mm-hmm.
People who are other abled aren't. And so it's about you starting to say and recognize, one, am I paying attention to where I am? And two, am I looking in a different place?
I think that's really important. Also, I think this industry traditionally, and you both know I came from the trade, right? I worked in the trade for many, many years. This industry traditionally hires from within. And one of the things, I kind of joke about this industry as a whole, it's one of the oldest industries on the planet, literally. We can trace this back, we can trace alcoholic beverages back for thousands upon thousands of years. And there's something that's important about the tradition of the industry, right? The history, the tradition, the culture. It's one of the reasons why I got into the industry, because it's fascinating. And yet there's this dichotomy which exists, which is, okay, we're going to hold on to this tradition and we're going to be so slow to change. And now this past year, with people really adopting technology and saying, how do we reach the consumer faster? How do we reach who we want to hire faster? The industry has been forced to change in a way that they never thought they were going to have to, especially with cellar doors closed or breweries closed where you couldn't visit them. There's something that they've really had to think through their consumer strategy and their hiring strategy in a different way. So yeah, I great points you bring up. And Chanel, is there anything else that we haven't talked about today that you want to share with folks who are listening, just about how they build their brands from a DE&I perspective, or anything else that you'd like to share with folks?
Well, just to touch on that last question that you brought up in terms of just draw a blank, excuse me.
Actions they can take, or creating that diverse and inclusive workplace that.
Oh, that's what I'm sorry. Yes. So I look at that, of course I would go with the top things that, most people are looking to see happen, in organizations, diversifying the C-suite and board positions and senior management positions and things of that nature. I think that's important. We don't see enough representation at the top. And more importantly, right, not just placing them there, but giving them the tools to be successful, right? We're not just going to put you at the top and say, hey, now we have somebody in a senior management position. Organizations should also probably consider a top-down approach in terms of mentorship, right? I'm a huge advocate for mentorship. Literally, as I'm building my brand, I'm mentoring other brands so that they can be successful. Like, I'm so big on that. And so I think if organizations do more of that, it would be helpful. And then also, your cross-pollination of skills and background, right? Ensuring that diversity extends beyond the physical attributes, right? And classification. It's equally important to have diversity in thought. So, this may entail looking beyond standard profiles and skills to fill certain positions, but these are just some of the things I think organizations should take steps towards in order to kind of diversify their workplace or their organization. In terms of just, I see a lot of new brands. I started in 2009, which is to me a long time ago. And yeah, and since I've started, when I first started, I say it all the time, literally, this is why I created the festival, because literally, I would walk into a room and no one looked like me. There wasn't any representation in terms of women. There wasn't any representation in terms of African Americans, and there definitely wasn't anybody in there that was, LGBTQ plus. So I walked into the room a lot of times feeling uncomfortable, feeling like I didn't belong. And so this industry has changed so much in terms of the growth that I've seen over the years, right? A lot of new brands are coming in and, they want to take quick steps and things like that. But I just want to encourage a lot of brands to do their research, take their time to understand who their target consumer is, who their competition is. That's very important. And then, form and build relationship with those who can, help you progress, those who can help you gain that market share, and things of that nature. It's an exciting time to see a lot more of us in this industry. But right now, what's important is that they focus on what matters, and understand how your product differs from others in your category. I can't tell people enough. I have brands that come to me all the time. I'm thinking about starting X, Y, and Z. I won't say what it is. And I say, well, do you know how many people out here are already doing that? Have you done your research? How are you different from these other 12 that are already doing that? And they've most recently launched their product, right? So, just things of that nature is what I would.
I appreciate that. Well, we are now at the top of the hour. So I appreciate the two of you coming here and spending time with us. What we're going to do for the community is we will send this out as a recording. So folks who weren't able to come on today, or maybe had to jump on and jump off, they can share this with their teams, their people back in their workplaces. And before we hop off, I want the two of you to give a quick plug. So Chanel, can you tell folks where they can find your vodka, where they can find you, and when Bo's Fest is and where it's going to be located?
Yes, so you can find all information about where we are being sold for Fou-Dre vodka at www.foudre-dre.com. If you go to our where to buy section, you'll see all the locations between DC, Maryland, Virginia, Texas, and California. Yeah. As well as Singapore, but if you're not in Singapore, then that's irrelevant. And then Bo's Fest, we have it every year, the last weekend in September. This year, it will be September 25th and the 26th. This is our first year doing a 2-day event, but we're excited. We have a lot of vendors that have signed up in terms of wine and spirits, a lot of new spirits that have launched within the pandemic, right? They want to showcase their products here. And so we would love for you to come out. You can find more information on Bo's Fest at bosfest.com.
Awesome. And Cornelia, can you just share with folks where they can connect with you?
Absolutely. So on all social platforms, that would be Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn. It's at Cornelia Shipley. And then I put in the chat our website, which is just www.3cconsulting.com. And so there's 2 C's. As long as you find it with 2 C's, you'll find us. And we are not the cannabis company. So I have helped you. We are not 3C Cannabis Consulting. We are
not yet.
Consulting. So, we are not the cannabis brand. And so that's us, www.3cconsulting.com.
Well, I want to thank you again for your time. I know you're both very, very busy people, and I really appreciate the work you're doing in the world, each of you. And so thank you. And thank you for those of us who joined us today. As we say here at Vino Karma, continue to go out there and create change, one sip at a time. Cheers.